She's a lot of fun on the VC. She's everywhere. She's one of the nicest people on the VC. Hi VC, Brother Eric here. Welcome to the Plastic Soundwave Call. Okay, so I want to preface this video with a lot of the music I'm going to talk about. I got references on, but I don't actually have. The album that I'm going to be talking about is on its way, but things, as we know, are a little bit slower these days. So setting that aside, I wanted to talk about a song that I found out about that I never had heard before from an artist that I am familiar with. And it was funny, I was watching a video from Rachel, the Music Man, and she had brought up that she had seen a video from Jesse, who I've just recently discovered. And through those videos, found out that Mercure put out a new album. Now, I don't have her second album, but I do have her first album. And so this album here, I got acquainted with Mercure. She does a mix of black metal and traditional folk music. I've heard it called Viking metal. There's a lot of actual metal bands that are in this genre of folk metal. So this is her album M. I lucked out and got a really nice copy with silver and purple. Merge. Beautiful looking album. Beautiful album to listen to. Probably some people wouldn't care for this because of the black metal that's on it, but they'd probably really love the quieter parts of this record. And she makes me think a little bit of Tori Amos, and I discovered her watching the Amoeba channel, What's in My Bag, and she was one of the people on What's in My Bag, and she had a very interesting mix of music, and I ended up looking her up, and that's how I found out about this album, and that's when I got it, and that's how I got into her. So we go to Rachel, who has just said in her video that Mercure has a new album out, and it's called Folk Song. And there's this song on there that when I listened to it on, you can hear everything on YouTube, so I looked it up. It's on YouTube. Listened to it, decided to buy the album based on that song, The House Carpenter. Or I believe it's just called House Carpenter. So the thing about Mercure is she's Danish. And what's interesting about this album is she has a beautiful voice, but I have no clue what she's talking about because it's all in Danish. This song, House Carpenter, is the first song that she's done that I've heard that she does in English. And I've never heard this song, but it is a hauntingly beautiful song. You sound like you're right there on the English coast with these people. It's just amazing to me how pretty this song is. And as being picked as a pretty song for Rachel's contest, it takes the cake. But clearly, this is a traditional song. And I looked it up, and the first thing that came up, of course, a folk song, Bob Dylan. And as all things tend to work in music, all things, all roads lead to and from Bob Dylan as far as folk music goes. So I began to think, okay, actually, this is a Bob Dylan song. But when you look it up and listen to his version of it, it says traditional. So that means he didn't write it. And as you start to look up, you start to find out that. So as I start looking up this song from Dylan, I find that there's a Joan Baez version, and that there's all kinds of other versions. This is actually a heavily covered song. And it's weird to me that I'd never heard it before. And I ended up finding 50 artists who covered this song. Now they've done it under different names and different titles of this song. And it started making me wonder, well, where does this song come from? Because as I'm starting to find out, some of them are not called House Carpenter, they're called The Demon Lover. And one is called The Wren Hotel. And it's clear that all of these songs, though they're a little bit different, are pulling from the same source material. And so I started getting curious, where did this song come from? What are the origins of this song? And it's one of those things that normally I would do on my own and nobody would ever know about it. I figured, what the hell? Maybe there's 3 people that might find this interesting. But that song has a rich and deep history. And it goes back a long way. And the things that I learned about this song, you know, I ended up learning a lot of things in history. And it's amazing how things really haven't changed all that much since the beginning of when this song was made. So as I start looking up these different things, I find a list of 50 people who have covered this song. And as I start going through on YouTube and listening to the different versions of this song, it is amazing the array of interpretations that people come away with. There's a metal version, there's a bluegrass version, traditional folk version, a folk pop version, country version, bluegrass, or no, I said bluegrass. But nonetheless, there's a lot of different genres that have played this song. And I've actually compiled 25 of those 50, because 50 would just be too big of a playlist. And some of the songs were I wasn't able to find. But these 25 all stand out and kind of show the history of this song in a playlist as far as recorded music goes. So, and I want to reiterate that at the end of all this, I will pick 5 of my favorite covers of this song. And so at that point, then you'll have a playlist and you can listen to that. If you have one that's not in the playlist that you like better, put it down in the comments. That would be great. I want to hear it. So the basic premise of the story that's in the song House Carpenter is about a woman who bequeaths her love. I said bequeath. So this story is about a woman who bequeaths her love to a man who goes out to sea. It seems like he's not going to come back. So she ends up marrying another man, has a child with him, and eventually the sailor comes back. Now, sometimes it's the sailor, sometimes it's the ghost of the sailor, and sometimes it's the devil himself. But this person or entity comes back and says to the woman, you know, I could have married a king's daughter and all this stuff. I didn't do that, you know, because I was saving my heart for you. And she's like, hey, that's on you. You know, I didn't know you were gone. And she says, anyways, you know, how are you going to give me a better life than what I have now? And he says, oh, I've got all of these ships. I have all of these men for these ships. I have so much money. I could take you to a place that's much more grand than this, and you can live out the life that you deserve. So she ends up liking that idea, kisses her baby goodbye, gives it to the husband, and goes off with the sailor. While she's with the sailor, she gets very depressed because she realizes she misses her baby. And eventually, the ship ends up being that it sinks. And as it is sinking, she notices hills far away. And when she asks the sailor, what are those hills? He goes, oh, those are the hills of heaven. But unfortunately, we're not going there. He goes, well, what are those hills over there? And those are the hills of hell. And that's where we're going. And that's generally where the song ends. Though there's different versions, some they just stops where she's sad that she's, you know, she misses her baby. Some do that full story. Some, a lot of them cut off a lot of the end and keep it fairly short. But the gist of it is that's the whole story. Now, as I'm going through these different songs and I'm getting into older and older versions of this song, I start seeing little clues to where this song is from. But how I got to that point is, and it's interesting because I noticed in this song when both men and women sing this song, and when men sing this song, they generally tend to sing it a little bit quicker, and when women sing it, though it's not always the rule, they tend to sing it a little bit slower. And it gives an interesting perspective on this song that women see the sorrowfulness in it and play it slower and almost sympathizes with the character that she made a bad decision. You're only human. Whereas when men sing it, it almost comes across as more like, hey, ladies, take heed. This can happen to you, you know, like more of it's a lesson to stay in place. Whereas with a woman, it's from a perspective of, you know, they could live it. But all of these songs are all the same in the fact that it doesn't end well for the lady of the song. So as I started listening to these songs and these different interpretations of this song, I started compiling a list of them just to compare them. Again, for the sake of picking five. And so I started using that to go back in time. Mercure, obviously, is at the time of this recording the latest version of that song. There's an artist called Eleanor Tomlinson who did a version in 2018. That Natalie Merchant did a version in 2003. The band Augie March out of Australia did it in 2000. A very unique version of the song by the band Hurt in 2006. And then, as far as I could tell, there's a bit of a dry spell The only thing really in the 80s and 90s was a version by a band called Custer LaRue in 1993, and it's called The Demon Lover. And so I found that kind of interesting that now that there's this new title for it. And I'll get a little bit more into that later because a few of these have different titles. Yeah. Don't step on the keyboard. This song was incredibly popular during the 70s and the 60s. Um, there's a band called Pentangle that does a very interesting version of it, and it sounds very Celtic. Um, in 1973, it was done by a man named Kim Larson, who's also from Denmark, and it's actually done in Danish. Uh, Peter Bellamy, a Irish guy who did it in 1979. A German band who just does an instrumental version in 1979 named Brussels Machine. As we go into the 60s, there's a Native American artist, Buffy St. Marie, who does a very beautiful version of this song. In 1968, Sweeney's Men, which is considered to be Ireland's first folk rock band, did a version of this song. Paul Simon in 1964 recorded a live version of this song. As we start to get into the early 60s, when folk was incredibly popular and made popular by Bob Dylan, Bob Dylan had done his version of it in a demo in 1961, and I believe came on an album later on. I don't think it was released in the 60s. But in 1963, you have an artist, Doc Watson, who does the song. Folk pioneer Jean Ritchie, she does a beautiful, just a cappella version of the song. There's another version where Joan Baez does it in 1962 on her third album, which is a live album, and that one's great because it tells the entire story. Again, a lot of these songs get cut off at some point. Some it starts off, it ends where she's sad at the end of the song. Others end where the ship sinks and it's just never gonna, ship sinks. The ship sinks never to rise more. And then even further, they go down to, whether they go to heaven or hell. And some say, oh, those are the hills of heaven, and we're just not going to go there, and it cuts there. Others do it where, no, where are those hills over there? That's hell, that's where we're going to go, and it generally ends there. And these older ones did a mix of that. As we start getting a little bit further back, we have recordings of this song by Clarence Ashley. It appears on a 1952 folk album, but originally he recorded it, but I couldn't find that particular recording. I found out that he did record it in 1930. Texas Gladden was a folk singer, and she did a version in 1948, which is a very traditional a cappella version of that song. And the earliest known recording of that song is by the Tar Heels. And it was recorded between 1910 and 1915. I couldn't find the actual song, but I did find the information on it. But the history of that song goes back beyond, recorded music. It's what's called a ballad, and it's a song that has a life lesson that's usually sung to a very simple tune, And there's a certain amount of these tunes, and the versions that you hear, these early versions, are out of the Appalachian Mountains. And these are sung generally by people that were considered Scotch Irish. These were people that either came directly from Scotland or directly from Ireland or by way of Scotland to Ireland to the Americas. And these were tough people, and they, early on in American history, took up residence in the Appalachian Mountains. And one of the ways they got through those tough times were doing things the old way, and that was singing ballads. And these ballads taught you life lessons and things to do. And much how we collect records today, they collected ballads. The tradition goes back way, way back. So, like I said, without a what we call physical media, these people either had to write down or memorize these songs. And that's how a lot of these songs existed amongst the lower classes, and was remembered through writings of the upper class, because generally the upper class were educated and the lower classes were not. And I hate to use those terms like that, but I would fall under lower class, to be in all fairness. But I'm just trying to keep it in simple terms. So these folk songs were sung by these people, and scholars would go in and collect these songs. And to have them and know them was great pride to them, just as our albums and CDs are great pride to us today. And one man had a very extensive collection of ballads, and he broke them up into the ballads and in categories that fell within those. So it would be a slice of a category and the story. So it's the basic story, but how the different ways it was told and where its origins come from. Because one of the things I saw once I got more and more into early recordings is I would see in the corner Child Ballad. Child Ballad number 243. It's like, this song is not a child's song. Well, I ended up figuring out that it wasn't referring to a child, but it was referring to a man with the last name of Child. And that would be Francis James Child. Child collected ballads, and he collected and categorized a whole bunch of ballads. So he has 304 categories that these ballads fall into. And they are a list of all kinds of subjects of how to live your life, how to be social, what's funny. It helped socialize people, because it was a social thing to listen to these ballads, or at least, get the family together to listen to these songs, because they still craved music like we do today. They just had to make it themselves. And so Francis James Childs went and categorized all of these different ballads. And as I went searching, I found this list, and then I was able to find the books that he wrote scanned online. And so for archival projects, these are some of the original publications of this book. But the very first one, Riddles Wisely Expounded. These are generally A knight courts three sisters, promises him, the youngest one, if he answers a riddle after he sleeps with her, that if figure out this riddle, then I'll be your husband. And it's a ridiculous riddle, but then she has ridiculous answers, so she gets to marry the guy. Child's Ballad number 20. The Cruel Mother. A young woman becomes pregnant while unmarried. She kills her child after it is born and later sees the ghost. Sometimes there are two ghosts. Child Ballad 81. Little Miss Grave and Lady Bernard for Mattie Groves. A noble lady seduces a commoner. They are caught in bed by her husband, who kills her lover in a duel, and then also kills her after she expresses a continued preference over the lover over him. Number 140. Robin Hood rescuing three squires. An old woman tells Robin her three sons have been killed for approaching. He meets a beggar who confirms the tale, exchanges his clothes for the beggar's. Robin then goes to Nottingham in disguise, summons his men, and rescues the three. So there were a lot of ballads about Robin Hood. Child Ballad 215. Rare Willie drowned in Yarrow or the water, O Gari. Willie drowns in the Yarrow and his lover finds his body. The ballad has many variations, though in most the lover is determined to share Willie's grave. And then we get to one that I find to be a particular favorite. Ballad number 243. James Harris, the Demon Lover. A man, usually the devil, returns to his former lover after a long voyage. Learning she has married a ship's carpenter and has had a baby boy, he entices her to sail away with him. They are not at sea long before she realizes she misses her son. On the horizon, beautiful hills, her lover tells her it's heaven, but they are headed for another direction, towards their final destination, hell. The ballad also is known as The House Carpenter. So Childs is collecting these ballads and categorizing them, and the reason why he's doing this is because when they collected these ballads, it was a source of pride and joy, kind of like how we do when, say, you've got a rare album that you want to show. Like, we get it, you want to show it off. It's your collection, you're proud of it. They did the same thing with their ballads. It was cool to have a ballad that nobody else had. And so they collected a lot of them. And the way that they knew that you weren't just making this stuff up is they would reference where they got the ballad from. And Child does this extensively. He wrote a 10-part or a 10-volume he wrote a 10-volume series of books on the breakdown of all of these different versions of ballads. And he traces it with the Scotch-Irish back to Ireland, back to Scotland. And he has reference material that he gets that explains where these came from. And so the way this would work is he would work backwards, or he would start with the oldest version and you would see how it progressed. The first iteration of this song being known as The House Carpenter's Wife started around the time when people were emigrating from the old country to the Americas. They're generally fairly religious, at least in their tone. And so these songs were a way to remember home, remember your values, remember your morals. Now, this had come from what was known as the Demon Lover. And the Demon Lover was what it was known by probably up until around like the beginning of the 19th century. Because this song still goes back even further. And so it's the Demon Lover, and it's usually paired with the name James Harris or James Harris. I think James Harris, or whatever the name is on that, is a Scottish version of the name James Harris. But he notes that in his notes what the differences are. And so the one is Scottish, but the tale originally comes from England, and probably south of England. And he notes this with a book called Pepys Ballads. And I kind of figured out, okay, if you have child ballads, that Pepys Ballads is a version that goes into what those original ballads are. And so, even though the James Harris story is borrowed a lot from a publication from 1812, it's that publication got a lot of its information from these Pepys Ballads. And Pepys Ballads were written by a guy named Samuel Pepys. And Pepys was a diarist. In fact, he's known as England's greatest diarist. And the reason for that is of the time that he lived. So Samuel Pepys lived from 1633 to 1703. And he lived in a key time in English history. He had survived the Black Death. He had seen the London fires. He had seen the rise of Oliver Cromwell and kick out the royals, and then the death of Oliver Cromwell and the bringing back of the royals. In fact, Samuel Pepys was on the ship that brought Charles II back to England to take the crown. And he was nervous because he was originally with Cromwell. But he kept meticulous diaries of what time he woke up because he was so proud of his new watch. What he ate that day, what happened in the news, what happened in the day, his affairs. And he was completely and totally honest about what was going on at that time in history and in his own personal life. So his writings are used to figure out how those people lived during the 17th century. And one of the things that Pepys did was collect ballads. And he also categorized them. He had 11 categories: thinking and categorical, devotion and morality, history, true and fabulous, tragedy, state and times, love pleasant, love unfortunate, marriage, sea, drinking and good fellowship, and humor and frolicking, etc. That's an interesting one because that's where you can kind of tell like Puritan sex jokes. And he put hundreds of ballads into these different categories. And one of those categories is where our story falls into. And the origin of James Harris, the Demon Lover, which later became House Carpenter, goes back to a story about a woman named Jane Reynolds. And the earliest known publication of this song comes probably, they're not totally sure, but comes from 1650. Though that is not what Childs references when he talks about Pepys. He references a particular publication by Thackeray and Passenger. And so that was a book that came out in 1685. And I believe it was finished up closer to, I think it was finished posthumously after Samuel Pepys had died. But publishers, with the newfound way, now that they could print books, people were having their memoirs and their diaries published, though that was not the intent when they were originally written. And actually, Samuel Pepys' diaries were published in his lifetime, along with his ballads. So the original ballad name is A Warning to Married Women. And it's a song that goes along the very same lines as what House Carpenter does, but this is the original version of that song that comes from... Hi, sweetie. Good morning. And in those days, if you could read these ballads, it would tell you what tune you could use, or for posterity's sake, what tune you use, which this tune is considered either John True or The Fair Lady from Miss Bristol. And that's that tune of... That's the tune that it's telling somebody who doesn't know that song what to go with, because presumably you know the tune. But for the most part, poor people just memorize these songs. In fact, ballads were the way that those people in those days got their news. It wasn't uncommon for a bard to hear a song one time, have it memorized, and that would become part of his regular repertoire as he traveled around different parts of the country. And actually, these bards would have huge conventions and get together and exchange these songs so that they could keep the rest of the country up to date and entertained. And so to me, the funny thing is that these people from the early 1600s who are going through this horrible time have exactly the same fears, wants, and desires as we do. We collect records, they collected ballads. So here in the 2020, we are worried about the COVID-19 virus. In those days, it was the Black Death. We had the same fears of disease. We had the same fear of being poor. We had the same fears of the economy falling apart. We like to collect things. They like to collect things. Things have not really changed that much. It's really just the veneer of culture that differentiates, that makes us a little bit different from them. We have phones, cameras, records, digital, computers, all of that stuff to try and get the same things that they did in those days. But they didn't have any of those things. So that fell on these people called bards and these ballads. And they were how you learned to live with other people. The things you should do and the things you shouldn't do. Where to get your morality from. All of these questions that we ask today were being asked in those times, and the song probably even has a more distant past. I bet you can find, if I looked hard enough, a trail that goes back to Denmark, which would swing it all the way back around to Mercure. Because many of these songs come from the Celtic traditions, and those traditions are really old and deep, but not recorded. And that's what I'm saying. These guys were recording for posterity's sake what the guys were doing in the 50s to get those old Appalachian songs, like how they did later on when they just want to remember these songs. So even today, the song of A Warning to a Married Woman still carries some relevance in today's society. And I personally found all of that shit very fascinating and interesting. I don't know if you did or not, and I'm sorry if I wasted your time. That just proves that it's not just about the music. So hopefully I've explained kind of the rich past that that song has and why music can join people together, even people across time. But I went through that whole thing just to let you know why I'm going to pick these 5 songs out of all of those versions that I like the best. And you'll find that all of these 5 songs will be listed. Just look to the eye. Number 5, Augie March. This is an Australian band. They just did a really kind of, it's almost like a fun version of that song. It's totally cool. Number 4 is by a band called Hurt. They did a version of this that's, it's the most different version of this song. And they get points for, you can recognize it, that it's a House Carpenter, but at the same time, they add a lot of depth to it. Number 3, Mercure. She had to make the top 5 because she's the one that taught me this song. Her version is so pretty, so beautiful, and it's just rich and dark, and with the reverb and everything. This one has the most brevity to it. You feel for the person telling the story, and you get that message, like, don't be like this person. But she doesn't tell the whole story. She does cut it off when the lady gets sad, and then that's it. I would love for her to do an expanded version of this song that includes the hills far and far away. Number 2, I went with Joan Baez. Beautiful, beautiful version of that song. It's live. The only thing that knocks this version for me is that it feels a little bit rushed as far as like the tempo. If she would have done this a little bit slower, I think it would have been easily the number 1. It's just the guitar and her voice, and that combination is just amazing, especially when you hear it against just some a cappella versions of that song. And my number 1 version of House Carpenter is by Natalie Merchant. It's kind of a pop folk. It comes from an album where she is doing ballads and folk music. And this is the signature song on that album. It has a nice crescendo to it. It starts off very simply and builds, just like the story builds the music on this builds as well. I could see how a lot of people would say this is a little bit more, straight of the road, but really, her voice isn't as operatic. She almost sounds more like the kind of person from the 1600s that would have sung this song, though it had a definite pop twist on it. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. This is just a little way that I nerd out on stuff, and I thought, okay, I'll share this with you. If you like stuff like this, let me know in the comments. If you thought it sucked, let me know in the comments. I do want to say that I think that this does prove that it's not all about the music.